Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Kruth. I'm a solutions architect with Atlassian, and welcome to the Ask the Experts blog series. I'm joined here today with my fellow solutions architect, Jacques Vanderberg. Jacques, say hello, man.
Hey, Mark. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's so great to be here on this awesome episode.
Yeah, you're our inaugural guest, so I'm super excited to get into this with you. We're trying this out. Hopefully, we're going to get some questions from our customers, those out there dealing with scaling challenges, and see what we can do to solve for them. And then also show them some cool things they can do in the tool to also answer that question. So, super excited. And I figure let's not waste any time. We've only got a little bit of time for our customers here today. So, I wanted to bring up our first question ever. And the question is, we are using process steps at the portfolio level in Jira Align and want to be able to deep dive into the work to find bottlenecks. Do you have any guidance on that? So what do you think, Jacques? That's a great
Okay.
question.
It
Process
is a great
steps,
question.
all these sorts of things, bottlenecks, everyone deals with it. So what are some
Yeah,
initial thoughts you've got on this?
it's such a great question. It's when we get in, I would say 99% of my engagements, right? uh, and so, but one of the things I want to start us off with is just to be clear that often companies or organizations confuse bottlenecks and constraints, right? And I want to make clear that those are two separate things here. So a bottleneck is simply, that component of the system or the step in the system where the capacity, the demand is greater than the capacity to deliver, right? But the constraint is actually that part of the system where it is the slowest throughput that constrains your system's overall ability to deliver, right? So important to understand that you can have many bottlenecks, but only one constraint. That one constraint will determine the throughput of the entire system, right?
I always go back to the weakest link. You're the weakest link. That constraint is the weakest link. You can only move as fast as that constraint.
Exactly. And so when organizations look for those places where they want to make improvements, it's important to understand that there are different bottlenecks and there are various bottlenecks in the system, but you need to apply your continuous improvement activities at the constraint of the system. If
So what would
not,
be some good examples of constraints that you've seen as you've worked with customers? I'm curious. I love this distinguishment between bottlenecks and constraints.
yeah.
What kind of things have you seen out there that really act as a constraint on a system?
Ooh, that's a great part. So um, before I answer that, I actually want to go into, how do you find these? How do we look for those? How do we identify them? And then let's look at the various types that there are potentially. So obviously identifying these bottlenecks, what you want to do is you want to look for large queues of work, of a unit of value, right? A unit of value. That's an important one. Because remember, what we're trying to do through these KMA processes is to increase the flow of value, not the activities, not the tasks, not those things, but the flow of value. So what we want to do is find those queues of build-up, of work in progress, of these units of value, right?
I love it. I love it.
And once we found those, once we find those, we can solve them, but they might come in different shapes and forms, which was your question. So how do we find these things, right? So an interesting one is that theory of constraints actually identifies that these constraints can be of various types. Some of these types are policies, people in themselves, paradigms, mindsets in and of themselves, right? So there are various types of constraints that can negatively impact the system. So it's not as easy as just saying, hey, here is my work that is building up. You need to actually understand why that work is building up, deep dive the root cause of why that is building up, and then solve for that. So it could be getting rid of some red tape. It could be changing mindsets. A great mindset one that I had was that could negatively impact the flow of work and create a bottleneck is if you measure the wrong thing, like lines of code. Measuring lines of code could negatively impact the way you produce value, which could result in a buildup of inventory and therefore create a bottleneck. So those interesting paradigms also need to be looked at.
So it's fascinating because, it sounds like, as we think about, what is it? Forms of waste within lean. We think about theory of constraints. All these things kind of come together to say things might slow you down. And it sounds like we may be able to say, yes, we want to optimize here, but Is there the possibility that if I try to eliminate some constraints in one place, that it could negatively impact other parts of the system? What have you seen with that, and that kind of almost systems thinking versus local optimization?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is a risk that organizations run. That is the risk that if you apply local optimization at a non-systemic constraint, you could actually increase the cycle time or the work in progress limit, the queue, at the constraint. And if something may sit in a system for longer, it increases the total cycle time, total throughput, and decreases the throughput. So you could negatively impact that. It reminds me of a quote also by Russell Ackoff, who is the organizational theorist and probably one of the pioneers of systems thinking. And he said, it's important to understand that the performance of the system is not the sum of its parts individually, but the product of its interactions, right? And so here it's important for us to understand how changing something in certain parts of the process has an impact on other parts. So really understanding that constraint and applying the continuous improvement point in that area, that's really, really, really key here. So
that's fascinating. And I think that's a really great call out there around that aspect, that although we may look at something and say, hey, we improve it in all these places, that doesn't mean that the system itself is optimized at that point. So I love that. So I want to go back to one other thing here is, so as we start talking about constraints, we start talking about bottlenecks and how we manage those to kind of help us deal with those constraints. Thinking back to that LPM, that portfolio level, what have you seen that portfolio teams do to help them identify constraints, to help them identify and even manage some of those bottlenecks? Because I know organizations will have things like a Kanban, similar to our customer's question here about using process steps. But how do they use those then to find that? What have you seen in the past?
Yeah, crucial is to have the Kanban. Our customer has a portfolio Kanban set up. That's great. Now the next step is identify the bottlenecks. The next step is identify the constraints. But how do you identify that constraint? Well, things like your average work in progress across the certain steps in the system, or your cycle times at each of the process steps, right? The slowest cycle time is probably an indicator of, the higher cycle time, which means it spends a longer time in the system, is an indication of a constraint, right? So what you want to find are these data points, compare them across your bottlenecks to identify those constraints, and then you can deep dive in there. And by deep dive, yeah. And by deep dive, there could be various ways to deep dive that specific part of the process. What we see often play out in portfolio level systems is in the early stages, where you're doing a lot of analysis and reviewing and clarification of the opportunity. You can probably start pulling those process steps apart and create more granular steps to identify specific parts of that clarification process where you're running into issues.
That's a really good point. And I apologize to stop you, but I think that's such a critical piece, because I want our listeners to hear that, because I think one of the misconceptions is that for Kanban, simpler is better. You should have a to-do, in progress, and done. But really, when you get in there, if you can't understand how your bottlenecks and constraints impact those parts of your Kanban, you actually want to get more granular, it sounds like, based on what you're saying with that Kanban. Figure out where the thrashing happens in your Kanban versus where, hey, it's just, I know it goes there and it takes anywhere from 30 days to 200 days to get through that step.
Spot on, exactly. So the rule about Kanban processes is start simple and then evolve from there, because people can spend months debating what are the perfect process steps they need to start with. So it is
8 steps or 15 steps, I don't know.
Exactly. So start simple and then start putting it apart. Awesome. In the latter stages of the Kanban flow, though, there's a different tactic you can use. So if you're in the implementation part, you can then actually go down the levels, the different flight levels. We call them flight levels. So portfolio flight level, a feature flight level, story flight levels, right? So in the implementation part, once you've decomposed that opportunity into multiple smaller pieces of value that can deliver this, you can go and track their process steps to identify oh, maybe there's something in that process going wrong. Maybe we need some DevOps improvements, some continuous integration improvements, some testing quality improvements, that type of thing that you can
It's that
investigate.
aspect where it's not just isolated to your portfolio level. And I think that's one thing I think our listeners should take away here is that although we may try to optimize at our portfolio level, really you have to understand the entire system. And that means
Yeah.
going down and saying, hey, if we're having issues in certain areas that we're trying to manage, let's see, is there underlying areas? Is there areas where the teams are struggling, which is causing this to then spike? So such a great point.
Absolutely.
One thing,
One
so
last
oh yeah, go for it.
So one other thing, or maybe not last thing, one other thing I want to mention is the other benefit of understanding these flows and solving them is when you get to, and we all know this comes from Little's Law, right? Where cycle time and
Yep.
throughput and are all related. Work in progress, cycle time and throughput are related mechanisms. But there's a second part to Little's Law, which says it only applies in stable systems where your average arrival rate is equal to your average departure rate. So what you're trying to do here is stabilize your system so that Little's Law can really be applied. And once you get to that stable system, that's where you can start doing a lot more predictions and forecasts on your data. So you can use throughput, historic throughput information to do stochastic distribution diagrams or stochastic distributions to get probability distributions of items being finished in certain timeframes, right? That's where it starts getting
fascinating. That is getting really, that really allows you to really analyze what is happening in that.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, we could keep going on for like hours. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I think something everybody deals with. What I want to do is I want to get us into Jira Align and actually have you show us, based on everything we talked about, talking about Kanbans, talking about looking at things like cycle time, WIP. I'd love to have you go in and show us how we can kind of look for some of these things, how we can use a product like Align to help us start driving some of those conversations about constraints and bottlenecks. So your game, I'd love to go jump into the product now.
Love it. Let's do it.
Awesome. All right, let's do it.
All right. Right, so welcome to Jira Align. I've jumped straight into our portfolio backlog here, as you can see on the screen. So we're currently looking at an entire portfolio's backlog for work we've got planned over a specific quarterly increment. So what I've done is I've already opened this up, and we're going to look at the Kanban that has been set up for this for this system, right? So as it's important, we have to start there. You have to start with setting up this this portfolio epic Kanban flow, which is also great for the leadership team to come around and identify the progress of work items in here. As you can see on the cards here, we've got cards in various stages. And what's great is you can see the different time that these items have spent in these stages, and then really deep dive and have conversations around those items that are lingering in these stages for a bit longer, right? So we want to make sure that those items are discussed, and we want to understand why they are lingering in there. So important, set up those process stages, start simple, and then use mechanisms like the average the time in process step and time in process flow to identify.
That's super neat to be able to have that kind of detailed ability to see that specific step, but then also the overall flow.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. Now that we understand the process flow, a couple of things to understand is that work in progress, right? So a great report in Jira Align to really understand that work in progress a work in progress for items is the work in progress by state. So what we're seeing here are various portfolio initiatives that are contributing to different investment themes. And if we hover over those, we can really see how the work that is linked to those initiatives and those opportunities federate through the system and impact the work in progress at various levels, straight down to even story level, if you wanted to see that, right? So great at understanding the impact of moving items into an in progress state and how that causes congestion in the system if there's too much work in progress, right? But there's also, if you want to view it by work in progress by step, so here we can see the different initiatives in those portfolio Kanban flow steps that we have, and you can see how the work that you are doing federates through to the different layers. And here we can see an example of a portfolio Kanban system and a feature Kanban system and how they're connected. Some more views for us to understand the work in progress, just the work in progress by step view to really get an understanding of, right, at this current point in time, where is the most of my work actually sitting? So again, getting the leadership team to really understand the work in progress across the system, because that all really determines the data points in the following reports, right? So now we can start looking at process flow cycle times across the entire system. So we can look at the cycle time for the average cycle time in days for each of those steps. So how many days do items spend? And obviously we want to identify those steps where the number of days are extremely high. And these could be indicators of potential buildups of work right before a constraint, right? So this would be an indication of a buildup of work. If we've got WIP limits in place and we're not pushing work across, but we're pulling it, this could be an indication that, yeah, there's a buildup of inventory in front of that process step. And there's a WIP limit. So yeah, getting an understanding of the cycle time, then the average days that each item spends in these areas. Here's a good example of why reading these two together gives us an indication or so. Items are spending a lot more time in implementing MVP, even though the cycle time for portfolio backlog is a bit higher, right? So these are examples. And what we're also seeing are these trends. So what the leadership team needs to be looking out for is that this is not continuously going up, because this tells us something is breaking that Little's law, right? If we can see our average rolling time constantly increasing, means either we're probably going to reduce some throughput throughout the system, right? So we also mentioned that, you know, you've got the ability to look at the various flight levels, those various Kanban levels. Here's an example of diving one layer down and specifically diving into the feature level Kanban for a specific program or a team of teams. And here we can also see WIP limits have been raised at certain steps, and we're clearly not adhering to the policies we put in place, and we're pushing too much work in this system, which will probably negatively influence the throughput. And then this isn't something we touched on, but it actually plays a super important role in understanding the bottlenecks. In most organizations, and especially organizations that are looking to scale their agile practices, they need teams to work together to deliver that unit of value that the customer is looking for, right? Ideally, we want feature teams, but we also know that, you know, it's not easy getting there. But the ability to understand these dependencies between the teams, and each handover between a team is essentially a point where inventory can build up, which again means there's queues of work. So the ability to visualize and understand the different dependencies and how they flow across your delivery mechanism, that's really, really, really important. And then our goal should be, if we cannot eliminate these dependencies, at least manage these dependencies really, really well. What's great about Jira Align, I really love its dependency module, because it makes dependencies first-class citizens of the application. It's not just a link between items, but it is something that really needs to be managed. And so when we actually do create these dependencies between teams, we can also use something like these grid views, where you can really see those intersections between teams that are really reliant on each other. And we can find those patterns and solve for the right things, right? Solve for the right things.
That was an awesome demo. Thank you, Jacques. I loved how you showed us how those parts of Align really play out to dealing with things like bottlenecks and constraints. So this has been a great first episode. Thank you again. Any final words, parting words of wisdom you have for our audience?
Yeah, I think we mentioned that during the conversation already, but just to summarize quickly, you know, start simple and find the constraint and before you start solving for anything.
Hashtag start simple. That's what we're going to start trending right now.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jacques. Appreciate you being here. For our audience out there, this is just the first of many episodes that's going to come out around asking our experts around these questions you have around Agile, scaling Agile, and all of the above. From today's session, we will have links down in the description to things such as Little's Law, as well as theory of constraints. So if you're interested in diving in more, check those out. For me and the Atlassian crew, thanks so much for being here, folks, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.